The really funny thing about Deep Dungeon is that this is the most successful game that Dog had. The game is pretty bad, but it hit at just the right moment to pick up some sales, and as a result, this Famicom Disk System original got ported to computers. The rest of Square's Disk Operating Group's output stayed where it was. To give you a little bit of context for why Deep Dungeon was so popular, at this point, RPGs on the Famicom consisted of Dragon Quest, and that's it, Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest II will be out in a month, but right now no one's really identified just how big RPGs are going to be on the system. However, RPGs were already huge on computers, and by late 1986, the RPGs in Japan had settled into two distinct flavors. The overhead ones that were leaning more into action, and the dungeon crawlers, more than anything else directly inspired by wizardry. As a genre, these consisted of first-person dungeon crawls, with the player exploring a maze of twisty passages all alike, and fighting the occasional monster in turn-based combat to get experience points so that they'll become stronger, and money so that they can buy better equipment. And in this environment, there was Hummingbird Soft, a computer game publisher who made, well, graphical adventures actually. These were the kind that were one step above the raw text adventures, where you still had text parsers and descriptions on screen, but you also had a picture of where you were at. So Hummingbird, a company that had never made a console game, never made an RPG, decided to make a game in the wizardry mode, and Deep Dungeon was the result. The plot of the game is that the Demon King emerged from the dungeon, and then went back to hang out at the bottom floor of his dungeon. As a generic adventurer, you get to try to go to the bottom of the dungeon to stop him. It is not the most creative of stories. The dungeon has 8 floors, and the nicest thing I can say about Deep Dungeon is that it's not a game where you just clear a floor and move on. Your path to the Demon King will require going back and forth, finding items to open new paths, and the dungeon is actually a bit of a 3D maze, with stairs doubling back on you. Now that said, the floors aren't especially large. Every floor is a 32 by 32 square, and this isn't one of those situations where walls exist between the squares that you walk on. Walls and doors occupy a full square, so that space gets taken up awfully fast. It also isn't a persistent dungeon. You don't make permanent changes to the environment as you go. So if you find a treasure chest on a floor, then leave that floor and come back, that treasure chest will be there again. In fact, you have to take advantage of that to make any progress at all in the game. As you're walking around, you use the D-pad to move, and you press the B button to enter the menu of commands in the lower right. From top to bottom, there are attack, items, run away, investigate, and talk. All of the commands are available at any point, even though most of the time it'll be pretty obvious what you want to do. For items, any equipment that you purchase is used automatically, and you have a pool of bread and water, which are your health recoveries and antidotes. There are also other items you can get that when you use them, they cast a spell of some kind. Those items are really pricey, so I didn't get them while I was playing. You start out in the town talking to the king, and the town itself is just a menu, where you can go to the inn, an item shop, weapon shop, armor shop, or go into the dungeon. If you enter any of those establishments, you meet... oh boy. Well, that's certainly a choice. As a rule of thumb, you don't want somebody commenting on your game to go, well, it's not as bad as it could be. So let's just move on. When you encounter an enemy in Deep Dungeon, which is surprisingly rare, you have to choose from that same menu of commands, and mostly you'll want to attack or run away. There's a bit of randomness in how long it takes before an enemy reacts, so it's very likely that you'll get multiple attacks in before an enemy strikes you. Something to keep an eye out for in the dungeon are piles of junk just sitting on the floor. When you search these, you'll either find treasure, or you'll find an enemy. And honestly, either of those is pretty good for you. Early on, you kind of need both. Especially since the encounter rate is about one fight every 60 seconds. Yes, it's on a timer rather than being triggered when you move through squares. What you should do for about your first hour of play is map out the first floor, find the trash piles, because there's quite a few of them, and then just make circular trips back and forth to those. Earn some experience to level up, and get enough money to buy better equipment. You'll encounter some people in the dungeon that you can talk to, but sometimes they'd rather attack than chat. That's fine, just more experience for you. You can save your progress at any time by pressing select to bring up the save menu, and then use the start button to choose to save. Yeah, they've got a really weird mix of interface concepts here. Obviously, since Deep Dungeon was popular, it got sequels. 3 of them, in fact, and I've already talked about Deep Dungeon 3 and 4 when I was doing my daily guide to the Famicom library. As a reminder, 3 was extremely similar to this, but 4 was actually a decent game. And as you might have guessed from that, this is not a very good dungeon crawler. With just one character, and the only thing you can do with them is get more hit points and buy better equipment, it doesn't really feel like you're making a whole lot of progress. The dungeon design itself is decent, but it also feels a bit empty. I'm not exaggerating when I say that when I was 12 years old, I coded a more complex dungeon crawler RPG in BASIC than this. Deep Dungeon is the bare minimum dungeon crawler. The minimum amount of design and effort that you could put into a dungeon crawler and still call it a dungeon crawler.